Hi, Grandma here reading The Golden Goblet, Chapter 13. In Chapter 12, we found out that it appears that Gebu and Wenamon are about to leave, perhaps for the Valley of the Pharaohs to rob tombs, and Ranofer is going to follow them. I think that the feeling is because it's a big festival that nobody will be guarding the tombs. The stars spangled the sky when Ranofer woke to the pad of Gaboo's footsteps crossing the courtyard the next morning. Memory swept over him, and with it a chilling knowledge of the thing in store for him today. He lay still, eyes tight shut against reality, but he could not shut out the whine of the storeroom door, the footsteps coming out again later, and finally the soft click of the gate. Gaboo was gone, and he must not get away this time. Ranofer rose from his mat and ran across the pavement and into the storeroom. A splash of water on his face, a thirsty swallow or two, and he was searching hastily for food. There was half a loaf and a couple of onions. Ranofer started on the bread as he left the room, trying not to picture the coming feasting in the streets of Thebes. The chances were slim that he would ever taste another honey cake. He walked quickly across the courtyard, everything in him wanting to run the other way. At the gate, he paused, his hand already on the latch, and suddenly leaned his head forward against the worn, familiar wood. He was shaking all over. I wish I were someone else, he thought. Hecate or the ancient, or Kai the baker's boy, or even a cat or a dog. Then I would not know any secrets. I would be going out to feast today instead of some dark and fearful tomb. He was not someone else, though. He was Ranofer, the son of Thutra, who loved his Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt and wanted to be free. He took a deep breath and opened the gate. Gaboo's shanty was only a faint glimmering in the dark street ahead, but Ranofer waited until it almost disappeared before he ventured out. Keeping the pale blur just in sight, he followed it through the winding, narrow alleyways of the city of the dead and across the barren land beyond, while the sky above him turned faintly gray and the stars vanished one by one. By the time the high western cliffs were stained with the first pink of dawn, he was moving along directly below them, with the city, the flower fields, and the strip of desert all behind. Presently, Gaboo vanished into a cleft in the rock face, and when Ranofer arrived at the same spot a few moments later, he saw a winding pathway strewn with boulders, hardly wider than a man's body, leaning upward into the hills. He moved up it nervously, not liking the sharp curves which prevented him from keeping Gaboo in sight in order to assure a safe distance between them, not liking at all the walls that pressed in on either hand with no crevices in which a boy might hide. He'd passed the seventh curve and was still climbing when he heard a mutter of voices ahead. Gaboo must have arrived at the meeting place and found Wenamon waiting. Or had he encountered a guard? Ranofer crept closer, listening. May regret this day, impatient one. It was Wenamon's murmuring voice, that was certain. Gaboo lashed back at once. Fool, who would follow us? Even the guards of the valley will be feasting in Thebes. There was another murmur. Then Gaboo snapped, You are witless and a coward. Go look back down the path if you must. Ranofer went numb. As a footstep crunched just around the curve ahead, he whirled and scrambled straight up the rocky wall, seizing at cracks, minute tufts of grass, whatever he could get a hold of, and expecting every instant to feel a rough hand grasp his shanty. There was a narrow shelf formed by an outthrust boulder just above the height of a man's head. Ranofer rolled himself onto it and lay as still as death. The next instant, Wenamon's cloak-wrapped figure appeared around the bend. The mason stopped. his bright, suspicious eyes darting every way but upward. He advanced soundlessly, passing so close under the shelf that Ranofer could have touched the black plaits of his hair. He padded down to the lower curve, peered around it, and listened a long moment while Ranofer lay rigid and sweating in plain sight above him. Then he turned, retraced his steps, and vanished around the rocks ahead. It was some time before Ranofer could gather strength to slide down the path, and when he did, his legs were almost too weak to support him. Nevertheless, he forced them to move into the direction Wenamon had taken. In view of the miracle just past, he could almost believe the gods were protecting him. The next bend disclosed the place of the broken tree, a wide spot in the canyon-like path where a scrawny, strange-looking tree grew out of a cleft between the boulders. Beyond, Gaboo's hulking back and Wenamon's stooped, narrow one were just disappearing over a last rise. Ranofer could see now that the rise formed the summit of the western cliffs, up the furrowed and craggy face of which they had been climbing. To the east lay Thebes, spread on both sides of the swollen river like a many-figured carpet stained in 100 delicate colors by the morning light. Beyond the rise to the west, the way opened out and the path descended into the valley. Ranofer paused a moment, looking back upon the spread-out city. As he watched, 7 red and white pennants rose simultaneously on the palace walls, and he caught the faint, squealing notes of a trumpet. It was the signal for the festival to begin. Soon the great procession would burst from the gates of the Temple of Ammon far across the river. Later at midday, Pharaoh would come from his palace to throw open the first canal with his own hand, and the streets of Thebes would be full of food-laden tables and joyful people and spilled barley beer, and he would not be there. Perhaps he would never be there again. Ranofer wanted nothing more in that moment than to be back in the street of the Crooked Dog, or even in the stone-cutting shop scrubbing at some block of granite with his sandstone, or chipping at a coffin lid. He bit his lip hard, turned abruptly from the city that was his world, and started down the stony path into the world inhabited by the dead. It stretched before him, a wasteland of glaring red hills rising from the giant's block pile of tumbled boulders, desolate, barren, and ominously still. Nowhere was there a single sprig of green. The sun had cleared the horizon now. By the time he reached the valley floor, it was beating fiercely upon his naked shoulders, reheating rocks and sands not yet cooled from yesterday, wrapping the whole valley of the tombs in shimmering, burning heat. Ranofer, threading his way among the scorching rocks, wondered in panic if he would ever be able to find his way out again. Every pile of boulders looked like every other. The cool, flooding Nile and the familiar streets of Thebes seemed as far away as the stars. High above him in the brazen sky, a lone falcon wheeled. Far ahead, the figures of Gebu and Wenamon were dwarfed by their surroundings to mere swatches of black and white. 2 thieves, a falcon, and himself. Except for these, not a living thing stirred in all this burning, silent world. Other things stirred, though, wraith-like things, unseen, unheard, but present in their hordes, even in the glaring daylight. The Ba of the dead could roam by day as well as by night, if they so chose. And would they not often wing about this lonely city of their mansions, assuring themselves that all was safe and undisturbed? Surely a footstep, sounding faintly in their dwellings far below, would bring them fluttering in anger up their shafts into this hot, still air, set them searching this way and that for the intruder. Licking his parched lips, Ranofer tiptoed nervously across the sands, wondering if even now he was treading over the hidden chambers of some long-dead pharaoh and rousing his outraged Ba. He jumped as he heard the faint seven-noted cry of the falcon and stood with pounding heart, watching it soar toward the south. When he turned back, the two figures ahead of him had vanished without a trace. In consternation, he scanned the cluster of rocks where he had seen them only a moment before, then broke into a run. Even their dubious company was preferable to this death-haunted emptiness which surrounded him now. Apprehensive and breathless, he arrived at the rock pile, stopped short, and sprang back behind it. Not 3 paces away on the other side of the rocks where the two he followed worked busily at something he had not time to make out. He stood flattened against a hot boulder, trying to control his jerky breathing. He could hear crunching and scraping, an occasional guttural curse. Then the noises stopped and all was still. Moments later, he dared peer out around the boulder. What he saw was an irregular black crevice in the rocks ahead, and a scattering of small stones around a large one, which had evidently been rolled aside. Was this the entrance to the tomb, then? It looked barely large enough to admit a man's body, much less the huge coffin that must lie somewhere below. Ranofer crept out of hiding and stood, peering fearfully into the crevice. It did not look like any tomb entrance he had ever seen or heard of. Casting a nervous glance over his shoulder at the desolate valley in which he was now utterly alone, he lay down flat on the hot sand and lowered his head into the dark, irregular hole. He could see nothing for a moment. Then a dimly glimpsed surface made him stretch an arm down to explore it. It was a narrow projection, perhaps a step. Wriggling forward, he eased more of himself over the edge until he was hanging head downward into the hole with the edge cutting his waist. His groping hand touched a second projection, not quite an arm and lengths below the first. Another step. It was certainly an entrance of some sort. This flight of crude and uneven steps hacked out of the rock and earth led down the shaft. At the bottom, a passage must tunnel away toward the tomb. Ranofer wriggled backward again and got to his feet, threw another uneasy glance around him, and turned back to the crevice. He could not make it out. Never could a huge coffin have been carried down the shaft. It must be a second entrance to the tomb, a secret one. And I'm going to stop there, and I'll continue reading the next time. Bye-bye.